Hello, my name is Chris Kent. I'm the president of the Sunhaven Research Group and also the vice president and founding director of the Multiplanetary Society. I'm here to give you a talk on bioengineering for a sustainable future. Now, this talk is not something I usually give, to the public. It's formative. I'm working on a book and a few research projects. That the book isn't going to be out until next year. So you're going to see me glancing at my notes, just for full disclosure. So let's start from both the environmental and the food perspective. So there are some types of society, and this is relatively new thinking in terms of the history of humanity. There's hunter-gatherer society, the original, the OG. There's agricultural societies, and we're largely an industrial agricultural society right now. And then there's horticultural societies, and this is the new bit of thinking. So horticultural societies generally follow a pattern where they're not necessarily using annual plants. They use perennials. They use biomes engineered, typically called food forests, and other forms of what they call permanent culture, permaculture. Now, the hunter-gatherer to industrial agriculture, the general paradigms, the shift throughout history, why this is important and for sustainability is because of stability. A hunter-gatherer society, incredibly stable for potentially tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, our entire evolutionary history. Horticultural society, this new kind of society, which is exemplified by food forests in various indigenous cultures, basically engineering sort of occasional found agriculture, and planting, encouraging planting, and creating an environment around you where food is abundant. Most things are edible, or they support pollinators, this kind of thing. Well, horticultural societies are also incredibly stable, more so than hunter-gatherer, because you have surpluses. Now you get into annual agriculture. We'll call it agriculture because it uses annual crops, crop rotation in advanced forms, this kind of thing. It produces even more surplus, but at a price. It becomes volatile. You miss a planting, you miss a seeding, you miss a harvest, you grow a monoculture, and you have a blight because you're growing one, fields of one thing. It's very risky. And of course, time and time again, we've seen throughout history, we've seen cultures fall because they experience famine from annual agriculture. Now, it's not all bad. The surpluses are nice. They allow us to have a larger population, not necessarily more free time on an individual stance. Those farmers having to raise the crops, especially pre-industrial, we're talking, having to raise the crops, they pretty much had to toil. But you did have then a division of labor in society because there's more surplus, there's more population, there's more people. And this division of labor then allows specialization. Now, when we get to industrial agriculture with modern inputs of herbicides, pesticides, especially fertilizers, and machinery, this kind of thing, automation, industrial agriculture is still subject to a lot of the same kind of risks. However, it's optimized for labor. So the individual farmer on the tractor, with machinery, can take care of vast have full of crops. So the labor optimization allows us to have transitioned from societies where a large section of the population were farmers to where our current societies, at least in the mechanized developed worlds in industrial agriculture, where relatively few people are farmers. but it still has the instabilities, still has those inherent, and they're only mitigated by the global systems, by supply chains, by various new technology. And when those mitigations fail, when that technology fails, when we have supply chain shocks, then we're back to a very fragile society. And now we're seeing that recently. Recently, we're seeing supply chain disruptions from major wheat exporters due to war. We're seeing supply chain disruptions for seeds due to pandemic, where shipping is interrupted. And if your farmers can't plant for a year, for a season, then you're out food for a year, maybe longer, because they have to go and do something else. You no longer have the economic systems in place. The whole system takes damage quite easily. Now, let's go back and look at that horticultural society. So I mentioned food forests. Well, what is a food forest? So it is instead of planting fields or gardens where a small layer is producing food, there's photosynthesis. If you take a look at a wheat field or a corn field, for example, or a soybean field, there's a relatively small layer of life along the field and many, many, many fields. And that's photosynthesizing, producing food, producing a crop. It's then harvested. And it is labor optimized, but it's not really land optimized. We can get huge yields out because we have all of the fertilizers and whatnot. We can plant very densely. But a food forest can get similar or greater yields and is labor optimized in a different way, where we need to spray, spray herbicides, spray pesticides, maintain annual crops. A food forest is all sorts of different edibles arranged in layers in a volumetric fashion. So that's 7 layers is usually what they say. Mid to upper canopy. So this is, tall fruit trees, nut trees, but even could be tall shrubs or in some extreme outliers, there's actually giant sunflowers, and they get to be quite tree-like. And of course, this is all contingent on incoming sunlight. So the mid to upper canopy, the top, tends to provide shade for crops and plants underneath. And all of these tend to be perennials. So they tend to be something that you would plant in place. They would root, they would form soil. This builds soil instead of plowing soil. It creates all the food webs and the mycelial, the fungal richness in the soil. It creates the whole biosphere. It's an engineered biome, and that's, of course, what we're all about. So from the mid to upper canopy, then you get a lower canopy or an under canopy, and that's dwarf trees, smaller fruit trees, smaller nut trees. You get a low shrub layer below that, and this can be berry bushes, typically currants, even things with edible leaves. Sometimes it's not strictly an edible. Sometimes medicinal crops are grown. Sometimes crops that are good for pest management or good for pollinators are grown. And it depends, because you're engineering a whole system just like a natural forest, but everything is geared towards some element of production or self-maintenance. Below the shrub layer, you have a herbaceous layer. Then you have ground cover, very low-hugging kind of plants. And this is important, again, because the forest system, much like a natural forest, manages the water. It prevents evaporation from bare ground. So all of your inputs, sunlight, water, pollinators, local wildlife, they're coming in and they're interacting with the forest. Underneath, you can also have a rhizome layer with crops, like root crops, that kind of thing. This gets a little bit into integration a little bit later, because generally you don't want to disturb the soil too much. But you can do mounds, you can do different techniques. And then you also have what's called the vertical layer of climbing vines and things that are basically using the forest as a support. And those can be fruiting or In a lot of cases, you can have various nitrogen fixers from the trees to the plants so that you don't have to put in industrial fertilizer. The plants themselves, like for instance legumes, they will fix the nitrogen themselves. And then you do have to sometimes encourage a food forest a little bit, but that's a balance. Generally, you want to optimize for labor, but when you're harvesting and whatnot, again, it's a balance. So some key points is that it has minimal industrial input. It's disease and blight resistant because you don't have a monoculture, you have a polyculture, many different plants, and they strengthen each other as well. There's some biome effects we'll go into later on from having food webs and things like apex predators around. From a human standpoint, because these biomes that we're engineering are human environments, they're for us. We are part of the environment, of course. We're part of nature, not apart from it, not separate. These produce local food and financial security. If you organize your society properly, if you have these food forests locally and you have different plantings, in your backyard, if you're in suburbia, in community gardens, in farms or market gardens that are peri-urban, so that are close, then you have low distribution costs. So it can be economically viable as well, and more people are realizing this. The fruit of course, you're not shipping with low distribution costs, short-run shipping, short-run distribution. You're getting another really important benefit is that your harvests go right farm to table. So this produce and this food is going to be more nutritious. Of course, you can still store it, and you can still cook with it, preserve it, make various different shelf-stable goods. In general, the food system itself can be farm to table plus shelf-stable, but for micronutrients, for various vitamins, for healthy food, fresh food can't be beat. And just it's delicious as well. So, from a financial standpoint, you can have much higher earnings. You might not end up growing a lot of commodity crops. You might end up growing more things like fruits, vegetables, specialty crops, supplements for health and wellness. All sorts of different potentials, and it varies locally. It varies, what your climate band is, what microclimates you can make. But it can provide an excellent life support system for the community. And it's just more stable than annual agriculture. You don't need to seed, you don't need to crop. And if you do it correctly, it can be very low maintenance. So really planting, harvest, a little bit of maintenance, looking for trouble spots. Generally organic practices would do. So you're also not consuming a lot of herbicides and pesticides. There might be interventions. If there's some sort of an odd disease, an invasive species, then it might be worth doing an intervention. But generally, we're talking organic here, but not the kind of labor-intensive organic farming that a lot of people have seen. That requires migrant laborers because you can't pay the labor cost. You don't need to do this kind of an approach. And the nice thing too, is you end up with planned harvests and planned yields throughout the year. So instead of growing one thing and then having at your harvest season, having megatons of corn, having giant wheat silos full of wheat, which is great. I mean, commodity crops have their place. But on a local scale, what you can do is by organizing and staggering your harvests, harvesting different things, because you've got this polyculture, you've got all these different species, all these different layers of the food forest, then what you can do is sustainably employ people, because you don't need a seasonal labor force. You don't need to hire in 100 harvesters. You don't need 100 pickers. and you don't have equipment and capacity that's lying fallow for the rest of the year. You have a continuous operation. So you escape so many vicious cycles that are traditional with conventional agriculture. Now, in my work, we look at these biomes with systems thinking. They're life support systems. In fact, I do a curriculum which is Earth Farms and Space Science, because these are the kinds of systems that we're going to be relying upon when we settle space. This kind of advanced science is also great as a mirror. We can look at advancements in miniaturization, material science, all of the latest tech that goes into space, and then we can get spin-offs, and we can get even just inspiration, just different thinking, different approaches, and cross-apply it to what we need here on Earth, not only in terms of expensive, in terms of high-tech systems, but when we're looking at a system, we want to make it appropriate. So it's better that it uses low energy. It's better that it doesn't require global supply chains. You've already cut yourself off from needing large amounts of regular industrial chemicals. So if you can also engineer the system so you don't necessarily need frequent replacement parts, you don't need extreme technical experts to come in. So that means people in the developing world could run versions of these systems that are simple, that are well engineered, but robust, resilient, and they last. And so we're basically going against everything you see let's take an example, one of my favorite movies, The Martian. So The Martian, of course, now spoilers, everyone. The Martian had an astronaut, Mark Watney, and he gets trapped on Mars, and all he has to eat is potatoes, and all he has to grow is potatoes. Well, one of the plot points in the movies is that he loses his entire crop. And he could have lost his entire crop for all manner of reasons, but once he did, it's gone. He had a monoculture. He could have gotten a disease. He couldn't have got a fungus, could have got a blight. And, I love that movie because it also shows, he needed chemical inputs. If you look at the way, all the potential failure modes for the thing that kept him alive, and then you look at what we're doing in modern society, you can see where the trends are unsustainable, where we destroy soil, where our economics for the inputs, for the industrial inputs, really render us vulnerable to economic disaster, to conflict. So we need this pretty much everywhere. Along with, you can integrate advanced systems too, modular mushroom farming, bioreactors. Now, a lot of that's other videos. We're getting a little far afield. But the other thing is, remember I mentioned that these are human biomes. So we're looking at biophilic effects. So the biophilic effect is that the humans, animals, we are of an animal species. They are part of nature, and as we're evolved to be in our environment. We're healthier when we're in our environment. So an example of this is, and it goes both ways. A neat example of this is in Yosemite National Park, sorry, Yellowstone National Park. I'm going by memory here. There was a researcher that noticed a marked decline over the decades in a photographic record of the park, of a river in the park. And the biosphere became less and less vibrant. There was less and less things growing, less species. Life was fading away. And he tracked the key change to the elimination of apex predators, wolves. And so at the top of that food web in the Yellowstone area, removing the wolves had all sorts of cascade effects negative effects. And when they reintroduced the wolves in really short order, the biome really picked up again. The environment was richer. There was more wildlife. There were more species all up and down the food web from the reintroduction of an apex predator. Now, this is also, there has a historical parallel actually in North and South America. In North America, specifically, we had, and now I'm again going from memory on the timelines on this. They had some fishermen and various whalers, this kind of thing, seafarers, were actually the first people to make contact with indigenous tribes here, with the First Nations. And so those Europeans and maybe even, I think it probably would have been European sailors, weren't here really in any extensive capacity. They just had to camp somewhere while they're doing their fishing and their whaling and that kind of thing. And this is well before the age where anyone started to settle here, a century, more than a century. But what did get transmitted was a different set of diseases. And so by the time that there was extensive settlement and exploration of the continent, a lot of the tribes and the First Nations were depopulated due to disease because they had no immunity to these diseases coming over. And we noticed, if you look at historical record, and you say even in the writings of Thoreau in Walden Pond, there's writings mentioning the woods as dense thickets. But then there's also lots of historical writings of being able to go and live off the land fairly easily if you knew the local plants and animals. And it turns out that in the modern day, now that we've looked at permaculture and we have the idea of food forests, it turns out that those dense overgrown thickets were partially degraded food forests. And because although, you could view humanity as predators, but actually we're apex manager species in this case. And the depopulation removed the apex management species, removed that small amount of, planting and care and harvesting. And so the otherwise rich environment was still incredibly productive compared to today. You could go and live off the land much easier, but it just reinforces, like the wolves, how humans are part of the environment. So this is the kind of thing we want to build. And just like how the environment perked up and everything became healthier, these health effects of being around nature have been documented in people and in humans. So in a way, living in these kind of biomes, these productive food forests, living in or near them, eating healthy diet, getting some exercise from being around them, just exposure to all the different pollens, all the different factors, the biology. It's a kind of preventative health care. Now, this is so I've talked about the benefits of these kind of biomes we're going to engineer from a financial perspective, from a food security perspective, from a health perspective. And I've talked about humans as an apex species. So how do we engineer the food forest? Well, I told you about the layers. We also look at other kind of things in permaculture because we want to live amongst this land. We want to try and use cities are often some of the best land. So if you can use even rooftop gardens, but if you can use urban areas and you can use the urban sprawl, often a low density urban sprawl, then we could have a good measure of food security right in the places we live. Now this will help us as well with local aquifers, because it'll help collect drinking water. If you build cisterns, you build roof catchment, that can help. It can help if you're now thinking about passive architecture. If you're thinking about systems and how everything interacts, well, then you start to think about the shelter systems and the way you engineer your buildings, because again, it's humans are in a biome. The city and the town and the farm and the house. This is our natural habitat. This is how we live, right? The horseshoe crab carries their shell. We build stuff, and so viable shelter, again, can follow this engineering ethos, systems thinking. Climate change. This is another topic. Of course, we're business people in the kind of thing that I do. We're often concerned with financially viable systems and with the numbers. We tend not to delve too much into the spiritual side of things, even though the environments that we can create are tremendously pleasant. That's the biophilic effect. The natural beauty that you're surrounded with is wonderful. But from a climate change perspective, from an environmentalist perspective, the benefits apply both to cyclical and anthropogenic theories. So whether you believe that climate change is cyclical, it's a natural thing, or whether you believe it's human caused, either way, again, having these living systems around us, because they're not subject to all of these shocks, these economic disruptions. Of course, they can be damaged by the weather, but these are biomes that, because they're balanced, much like a forest. If you have a storm that rolls through a forest, yes, trees will suffer damage, but the species will rebalance. And we're getting to the level where we can engineer biomes that behave in this self-healing way. It really is nature that we're recreating. So climate does change, whether you believe the origin of the climate change or not. Climate does change. Extreme weather does cause economic and personal damage. We've been very lucky as a civilization for millennia. The historical records indicate that we've been in a pretty good patch of nice weather for a long time. But if we want to insulate ourselves from potential disasters going forward on a local scale and on a global scale, if we do this everywhere, if we get on this, then climate change, in one way, we can help address that as well. Of course, we're also reducing the industrial inputs. So carbon footprint, water usage, general efficiency, all of these things are much better than the conventional industrial agriculture, with similar or better yields. Usually not yields of one thing. You have to be a little clever, and you have to be able to process or sell or cook or save and store and manage all the various harvests. So it's there's some things, there's some subtleties there, but it's definitely doable. We have a number of excellent examples in various countries of permaculturalists and agroforestry experts who are running really profitable operations. Now, the nuance: who knows how to do this? One of the excellent things is that there's a lot of science here. There's a lot of educational opportunities. So we talk about integrated educational opportunities, both just for the sake of learning and for the sake of knowledge, but also as an economic activity. So there's what's often termed the bioscience revolution, and this is just starting. A lot of experts believe that the coming revolution in biosciences will make the information age, make that progress look quaint. It'll unlock understanding of all the natural systems. It'll unlock understandings of nanotechnology, of incredible chemistry, of biophysics, and it will unlock understanding of ourselves. It already has radically increased our understanding of new medicines and new procedures, and just how the subtleties of the tremendous detail in biology works. All of the systems all of this knowledge in bioscience can be learned, it can be taught, it can be studied in a food forest. You know, your little lab station, you know, some scientific assays, going and counting pollinators, going doing microscopy, all of these kind of things that don't take a whole lot of equipment. We're not talking giant particle accelerators. We're not talking huge industrial apparatus to do science. We're talking, however, we are talking real experiments, real reasoning, and together with other things that are low-cost curriculum. It means that not only does the food forest give you finances, it gives you food security, it gives you, opportunities for employment that are relatively light-duty employment. You know, this is not necessarily back-breaking work if you do it correctly, but it also gives you an educational opportunity, which can be economic, or it can also provide some of the labor. You know, as the students or the interns are interacting and taking care of the food forest. So that's one of the things we're looking at as well, is how, you know, mushroom labs and green labs, we call the farms in the forest green labs, along with our scientific stations, and more advanced systems like aquaponics, aeroponics, some forms of market gardening that you can integrate with food forests. It doesn't always have to be permaculture, but the whole system approach lends incredible efficiencies to whatever you're building, the operation you're building. So with that, I think I'll move on to another point of the environmentalism is that we're pro-human environmentalists. So there's definitely a trend of the belief that humans are apart from nature, that humans are bad, humans are destructive, and certainly because we have the capacity to reason, the capacity to make bad plans, we can do bad things. But we're not apart from nature. So inherently, if we're operating as species evolved in biomes, we're stewards of nature. So yes, things can get messy. You know, sometimes I'm thinking in the book that I'm writing, one of the working titles for a chapter is Pro-Human Environmentalism, or Things Will Get Messy on Our Small Blue Green Rock. So yes, you know, sometimes we have things like fear of missing out, where the belief that a certain resource is scarce, or the quest for a finite resource will cause war and conflict, or various business strategies where sometimes people don't consider what they used to call externalities. They don't consider pollution, this kind of thing. You know, these can be destructive. But if we think about our environment as a system, and as a system that can help us and be productive and has a dollar value and has cares for us and educates us, all of the things that I've gone through, and we realize that this is part of being a species in nature, then the environmental problems are much easier to solve. It tends to be a guide. The view that we're apart from nature, the view that we're inherently destructive, is actually part of the problem. Now, I mentioned space science before, and the aspect of our work where we're looking at biome engineering for life support systems it's not really for current day space vessels, because we have very, very small space vessels, small capsules, small stations. But in just a few decades, when the scale of engineering in space gets much bigger, we'll be able to host biospheres of self-regenerating, natural life support, probably with layers of backup systems as well. because you don't want a plant fungus to end up, trashing your life support system. But the biome engineering is going to be the most efficient way to support our activities in space, long-term settlement in space. And again, this is kind of something that comes up and is paired with environmentalism, because if you think about it, the real function that we have, if you want to preserve the environment, we should really carry life into space. We should steward it and protect it and spread it, because it is a treasure. The biodiversity we have on Earth, the biodiversity that we've evolved from, that really supports us and keeps us healthy, that we don't understand, because we're just at the beginning of that bioscience revolution. We don't really know so many of the layers that are going on. These treasures, the biodiverse treasures that we need. Well, do we want to leave it all just on the planet? Do we want to have everything, all of our hopes and dreams and future here and in one location? And frankly, it's not that big a place. The world is quite small. The other thing is, it's unlikely that population is going to radically collapse. It's unlikely that industry is going to ramp down. There's so many things. Yes, demographers say that we're going to have population collapses, but then there's automation. There could even be radical technologies to increase fertility. As soon as the affluent nations, as soon as they realize that action has to be taken, they'll implement real funding into technologies that again have the potential, if misapplied, like say robotics. Korea, Japan, nations that developed nations with an advanced technology base that have a collapsing population. They've heavily invested in robotics. And the reason is because they need the robots to take care of the old people. They need the society to function and there to be enough productivity so that the people who can no longer work in their retirement have an infrastructure that supports them. So because there's not enough young people to do work the old-fashioned way, one of their bets is robots. Now, of course, we've all seen science fiction movies. Robots could go horribly wrong. But even if it's not Terminators and not, robots from the future like Arnold Schwarzenegger, misapplied robotics could do a lot of environmental damage. Strip mining, this kind of thing. So again, we essentially need to get our resources and need to relieve the pressure on our planet and our biosphere specifically, because that's what keeps us alive. So again, all of this work points to space, points to carrying life to space, points to living in space. It'll even have great effects in terms of, it won't be geopolitics anymore, but the politics of human conflict. Because when you have lots of room to spread out, when there's plenty of resources for everyone to go around, then you don't have, even if it's a false belief, you don't have the idea of competing for scarce resources. If there's just enough resources for everyone to go out and get, if it's practically post-scarcity, what we call a post-scarcity economy, then bioengineering, space settlement, good stewardship of the Earth, of the mother biome, the mother biosphere that we have, all of these things are interrelated. So bioengineering is going to be big, along with the bioscience revolution. And that's pretty much it. We are working on some of those integrated educational opportunities. So, feel free to reach out to me. And then when we have our first products and our sites, and when I finish writing that book, I'll be glad to direct you to lots of interesting things. I intend to make more videos as well. So reach out to me at the Multiplanetary Society. That's where we're championing this work. And until then, I guess I will say goodbye. And before that, say thank yous to everyone, to my colleagues, advisors, and friends. So, of course, I was invited here by Rafi and Carmina. Like to say thank you to the Multiplanetary Society, my colleagues there, Sunhaven Research Group, the Mars Society Philippines, again, Rafi, Raphael, Cohas Research, the University of Makati, University of Ottawa, Telfer School of Management, that's my alma mater, Athabasca, MITx, Carleton University, I think that's it. Can't forget, of course, more of my friends in the Philippines, Jacob Bell and Adrian. And that's it for now. I would say, go and, start planting. Go get some perennials. Start making a food forest. It's something we can all start to do. And get in touch with me. Reach out if you're interested in learning more. Thank you.